Chapter 1. The Weight of Silver. Amara's fingers moved with a precision that defied the exhaustion weighing down her eyelids. The air inside the underground clinic smelled of copper, stale sweat, and the sharp chemical bite of antiseptic. It was a suffocating cocktail that had become her only atmosphere. Above her, the city groaned under a relentless downpour, the rhythmic thud of raindrops against the concrete ceiling sounding like a heartbeat she refused to listen to. She had built this sanctuary for the discarded, for the wolves who were too broken for the high and mighty packs to claim. Because the pack system viewed weakness as a terminal infection, she had become the cure. Her current patient lay on the rusted metal table, a mangled mess of fur and raw flesh. The rogue wolf had been caught in a territorial skirmish, but the wound in his side wasn't from a claw. The edges of the gash were blackened, smoking with a low, unnatural heat that made her stomach churn. Silver. It was the coward's weapon, a metal designed to turn a shifter's own blood into a boiling poison. She reached for her forceps, her hand steady despite the tremors of fury humming through her veins. Why do they keep coming back to the borders of the very people who hate them? "Stay with me, Jax," she muttered, her voice a low rasp that barely carried over the hum of the old generator. The wolf whined, a sound of pure agony that shattered the silence of the room. She didn't offer him comfort because hope was a dangerous currency in the underworld. Instead, she pressed a soaked cloth against the burn, watching the steam rise as the liquid neutralized the silver's acidic touch. Her life was a series of these moments, fixing what others broke, surviving on the scraps of a world that had spat her out years ago. The rogue's eyes flickered, the golden hue of his iris clouded by the gray veil of impending death. Amara felt a pang of something she tried to bury: recognition. She had been that discarded thing once, standing in the center of a high court circle, while the Alpha's voice stripped her of her dignity and her name. She had learned then that a wolf without a pack wasn't just an outcast. She was a ghost, and ghosts didn't need love. They needed sharp scalpels and a thick skin. As she stitched the wound, her mind drifted to the whispers she had heard at the supply docks earlier that morning. People were talking about the Great Northern Pack, about a purge of traitors that had left the forest floors stained crimson. They said the new Alpha was a monster clothed in a man's skin, a shadow that moved faster than the wind. She didn't care about Alphas or their petty power struggles. They were all the same. Arrogant kings who thought their birthright gave them the power to break whoever they pleased. "Done," she whispered, tying off the final suture with a sharp tug. She stepped back, wiping her bloodied gloves on a stained apron. The rogue was breathing more easily now, the silver's fire finally extinguished. She looked at her reflection in the darkened window of a supply cabinet. Her eyes were hard, the warmth that used to define her replaced by a cold, calculating light. She was a mechanic of the soul, a woman who had traded her heart for a set of surgical tools. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the alleyway outside, cutting through the drumming rain. Amara froze, her hand instinctively flying to the heavy iron bolt she kept tucked in her waistband. The rogues knew the rules. You don't bring your trouble to my door. But the sound that followed wasn't a gunshot or a shout. It was a heavy, wet thud against the reinforced steel of her entrance. Something massive had just collapsed against her sanctuary. She moved toward the door, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The air in the room suddenly felt electric, a strange, static-charged energy that made the hair on her arms stand up. It was a sensation she hadn't felt in a decade, a pull, a magnetic tug that seemed to originate from the center of her chest. She reached for the handle, her breath hitching as the metal felt unnaturally warm beneath her palm. Who is out there? The door swung open with a violent groan of protesting hinges. The storm rushed in, bringing with it a gust of freezing wind and a scent that hit Amara like a physical blow. It was cedar, mountain air, and the deep, rich musk of an alpha. But beneath that power lay the unmistakable stench of rot. A man fell forward, his massive frame hitting the concrete floor with enough force to make the jars of medicine rattle on their shelves. He was soaked to the bone, his dark hair plastered to a forehead that was slick with sweat and grime. Amara stared down at the stranger, her instincts screaming at her to slam the door and bolt it. This wasn't a rogue. The sheer aura of authority radiating from his unconscious form was suffocating. Even in his weakened state, he occupied the room like a predator in a cage. Her gaze drifted to his shoulder, where a deep, jagged puncture wound wept a dark, shimmering fluid. It was a silver-tipped blade wound, deeper and more lethal than any she had ever treated. "No," she whispered, the word a plea to a god she no longer believed in. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she turned his face toward the dim light of the generator. Her breath stopped. The man was beautiful in a way that felt like a threat. His jaw was a hard line of granite, his features carved with a cruel perfection. But it was the way her skin hummed when she touched his neck to check for a pulse that terrified her. The mate bond, a thing she had declared dead the day she was rejected, flickered to life like a dying ember caught in a sudden breeze. His eyes snapped open for a fraction of a second, a piercing, molten silver that seemed to look right through her soul. He didn't speak, but his hand suddenly clamped around her wrist, his grip like a vice even as his body began to convulse. His skin was burning, the fever of the silver poisoning reaching his brain. Amara tried to pull away, but the connection was too strong, a tether of light and pain that bound her to this dying king. She was the only thing standing between him and the void, and she hated him for it. The storm outside intensified, a thunderclap shaking the very foundation of the clinic. Amara looked from the man to the door, realizing with a sinking dread that the hunt hadn't ended at her threshold. Whoever had done this to him was still out there, and they wouldn't stop until the alpha was cold. She was no longer just a doctor for the broken. Because she had opened that door, she was now a target in a war she had spent her whole life trying to escape. Chapter 2. The Midnight Fever. Amara strained against the weight of the stranger, her muscles burning as she dragged his massive frame toward the primary surgical table. Every touch felt like a spark of electricity jumping between their skins, a sensation that was both intoxicating and repulsive. She had spent years perfecting her emotional walls, but this man's presence was like a battering ram against her fortress. Because he was an alpha, his body was fighting the silver with a violent, primitive intensity that made the air in the room hum with his repressed power. The stranger groaned, a sound that started deep in his chest and ended in a jagged snarl. His bones began to shift beneath his skin, the wet, sickening crunch of a forced transformation echoing through the small room. Amara's heart lunged into her throat. "Don't you dare!" she hissed, grabbing a heavy leather strap from the wall. "If you shift now, you'll tear your own arteries apart." She worked frantically to secure his limbs, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps as she battled the man's delirious strength. He was a mountain of muscle and heat, his skin radiating a temperature that should have been lethal. As she leaned over him to tighten the buckle at his waist, his head thrashed to the side, his nose brushing against the pulse point of her neck. Amara froze, a jolt of pure, unadulterated desire lancing through her, followed immediately by a wave of crushing shame. How could her body react this way to a man who represented everything she loathed? She was a doctor, and he was just a patient, yet the room felt smaller with every breath he took. She grabbed a vial of concentrated wolfsbane, not enough to kill, but enough to suppress the shift. Her hands shook as she filled the syringe. She had to be precise. Too little and he'd destroy the clinic. Too much and his heart would stop. As she pressed the needle into the corded muscle of his arm, the man's eyes flew open again. They weren't molten silver anymore. They were a void of obsidian, the wolf peering through the cracks of his human consciousness. "Amara," he rasped. The syringe nearly fell from her fingers. The sound of her name on his lips was a caress and a command all at once. It vibrated in the marrow of her bones, a frequency she hadn't known she possessed. She hadn't told him her name. She hadn't said a word. But he knew her. Or rather, his wolf knew her. The mate bond wasn't just flickering now. It was a roaring flame that threatened to consume the very air she needed to survive. "Shut up," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Save your breath for staying alive." She turned away to prepare the neutralizing agent for the silver, her mind racing. Who was he? And why did the mere sound of her name feel like a brand being pressed into her skin? The mystery of him was a poison just as dangerous as the silver in his veins. She forced herself to focus on the work, the familiar routine of measurement and mixing providing a thin veil of sanity. The night wore on, the storm outside turning into a rhythmic accompaniment to the man's labored breathing. Amara stayed by his side, wiping the black sweat from his brow with a cool cloth. Every few minutes, his body would surge against the restraints, a low growl vibrating the metal table beneath him. She spoke to him in low, rhythmic tones, a trick she used for the wildest rogues, but the words felt different tonight. They were intimate, a secret shared between two people in the heart of a tempest. As the silver began to leach out of his system, the man's movements grew less violent, replaced by a heavy, oppressive stillness. Amara found herself watching the way his chest rose and fell, the way the dim light traced the rugged landscape of his face. He was a king in ruin, a fallen god seeking sanctuary in the dirt. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from his cheek, before she jerked her hand back. She couldn't afford to care. Caring was the first step toward the rejection that had nearly destroyed her. The air in the clinic grew heavy, the humidity of the storm mixing with the raw, pheromonal scent of the alpha. The boundaries between doctor and patient began to blur, eroded by the isolation of the midnight hour. Amara felt a strange, magnetic pull toward him, a gravity she couldn't escape. Her body ached with a loneliness she had tried to ignore for a decade, a hollow space that seemed to be the exact shape of the man lying on the table. Suddenly, he reached out, his hand breaking through the leather strap as if it were made of paper. He didn't attack. Instead, his fingers tangled in the hair at the nape of her neck, pulling her down until her face was inches from his. His breath was hot against her lips, smelling of rain and ancient forests. "I found you," he whispered, his voice a low vibration that seemed to bypass her ears and strike directly at her heart. Amara should have pushed him away. She should have drugged him back into unconsciousness, but the hunger in his eyes mirrored the starvation in her own soul. In that moment, the clinic, the silver, and the packs didn't exist. There was only the heat, the scent, and the undeniable pull of a bond that defied logic. She leaned in, her lips meeting his in a collision that felt less like a kiss and more like a homecoming. It was a desperate, primal connection, a joining of two broken things in the dark. The world outside continued to howl, but inside the clinic, a different kind of storm was breaking. Amara gave in to the sensation, her hands roaming over the man's skin, tracing the scars of a life lived in violence. He pulled her closer, his touch possessive and worshipful. In the heat of their passion, she forgot that she was a rogue and he was an alpha. She forgot that this night would have consequences that would ripple through the history of their kind. She only knew that for the first time in her life, she didn't feel alone. Chapter 3. The Ghost of the Morning. The first gray light of dawn filtered through the high barred windows of the clinic, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor. Amara woke with a start, her body stiff from the cold and the awkward position she had fallen asleep in. She was curled on a narrow cot near the surgical table, her skin still tingling with the ghost of a touch that had felt more real than anything in her life. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, her mind instantly rushing back to the events of the night. The heat, the scent, the kiss. It all felt like a fever dream. She looked toward the surgical table, expecting to see the massive frame of the stranger still recovering from his ordeal. The table was empty. The leather straps she had used to restrain him were torn to shreds, the jagged edges of the hide lying on the floor like dead snakes. The surgical trays were neatly arranged, the bloody bandages gone. It was as if he had never been there at all, save for the lingering scent of cedar and mountain air that refused to fade from the room. "Coward," she whispered, her voice thick with a mixture of relief and a crushing, unexpected disappointment. He had vanished like a phantom before the sun could expose the truth of what they had shared. Because he was an alpha, he probably viewed the night as a moment of weakness, a lapse in judgment brought on by the silver. She stood up, her legs feeling heavy as she began to move around the room, cleaning the remnants of the night's work. Every corner of the clinic felt haunted by his absence. She looked at the bloodstains on the floor, the dark spots marking the path where he had collapsed. She had saved his life and he had left her without a word. It was exactly what she should have expected from a man of his status. Alphas took what they wanted and discarded the rest. She was a fool for thinking the mate bond changed the fundamental nature of their world. Weeks turned into a blur of routine and repressed memories. Amara threw herself into her work, treating the endless stream of rogues with a renewed ferocity. She tried to convince herself that the night meant nothing, that it was just a biological anomaly. But the changes started small, a sudden sensitivity to smells, an unusual fatigue that made her bones feel like lead. She ignored the signs until she couldn't. Because she was a doctor, she knew the symptoms before the test ever confirmed the truth. The realization hit her like a physical blow on a Tuesday afternoon. She sat in the back room, staring at the diagnostic result on the small screen of her medical tablet. She was pregnant. The alpha heir, the child of a man she didn't even know, was growing inside her. A cold terror washed over her, followed by a fierce protective rage. This child was hers. It wasn't a pawn for a pack or a trophy for an alpha. "I won't let them take you," she whispered, her hand instinctively resting on her still flat stomach. She knew what happened to rogue-born heirs. They were either stolen and raised as soldiers or eliminated to prevent a challenge to the legitimate bloodline. She had to stay hidden. She had to erase every trace of that night. But even as she made the vow, she knew the world was smaller than she wanted to believe. A child of that power would have a scent that couldn't be masked forever. Her search for answers led her to the dark corners of the shifter internet, to the encrypted forums where the secrets of the Great Northern Pack were whispered in shadows. She spent nights scrolling through grainy photos and leaked documents, her heart stopping when she finally found what she was looking for. A photo from a pack gala showed a man standing at the head of a long table, his presence commanding the very air around him. The caption read, "Alpha Kyle Draven." The name felt like a curse. Kyle Draven was known as the Silver Wolf, a leader famous for his ruthlessness and his hatred of the rogue elements that infested the borders of his territory. He was the man who had orchestrated the very purges that had sent so many injured wolves to her door. He was the enemy, the architect of the system that had rejected her. And now, he was the father of her child. Amara closed the tablet, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. She felt as if the walls of the clinic were closing in on her. Kyle Draven wasn't just any alpha. He was a man with the resources to find her no matter where she hid. If he ever discovered the truth, he would hunt her down, not out of love, but out of a sense of duty to his bloodline. She was a rogue, a woman without a name, and in his world, that made her a vessel, not a person. The storm that had brought him to her door was nothing compared to the one brewing in her future. She looked around her clinic at the sanctuary she had built with her own blood and sweat. It no longer felt safe. It felt like a trap. Every shadow seemed to hold the glint of molten silver eyes. Every rustle of the wind sounded like her name being whispered by a monster. She had to find a way to disappear before the mate bond, or the child, betrayed her location. As she began to pack a small bag, a sudden realization stopped her in her tracks. The silver poisoning. Kale had been targeted by someone within his own circle. If he was in danger, then the child was in danger too. The betrayal she had sensed in the forest was deeper than she had imagined. She wasn't just hiding from an alpha. She was hiding from a conspiracy that had already tried to kill a king. Because she was tied to Kale, she was now a part of the game. She stood in the center of the dark clinic, the weight of her new reality settling onto her shoulders. She was a woman who had spent her life avoiding pack politics, and now she was carrying the most powerful political trigger in the werewolf world. She looked at the door, half expecting it to burst open again. The peace she had fought so hard for was gone, replaced by a high-stakes gamble for survival. She wasn't just Amara the doctor anymore. She was the guardian of a secret that could burn the world down. Chapter 4. The Scent of a Hunter. The morning air felt thin, a fragile glass that threatened to shatter at the slightest vibration. Amara stood in the center of her clinic, her gaze fixed on the heavy iron door that had been her only shield for 3 years. Because the human body possessed a cruel memory for trauma, her stomach nodded every time the generator hummed, mimicking the low vibration of a growl. She pressed her palms against the cool surface of her mahogany desk, trying to anchor herself to the reality of the present. Her body felt different, a foreign vessel carrying a passenger she hadn't invited but already loved with a terrifying, primal intensity. She reached for a vial of lavender oil, hoping the floral scent would mask the metallic tang of her own fear. Every sense she possessed had been sharpened to a razor's edge, a side effect of the pregnancy that made the world feel loud and intrusive. She could hear the skittering of a mouse behind the drywall and the rhythmic drip of a leaky faucet in the back room. But it was the silence from the alleyway that terrified her the most. It was a heavy, expectant silence, the kind that preceded a predator's strike. A sudden shift in the atmosphere made the fine hairs on her neck stand on end. The air didn't just move, it thickened, charged with an alpha's authority that tasted like ozone and ancient pine. She didn't need to look at the security monitor to know who was standing on the other side of that door. Her blood recognized him before her mind could process the intrusion. The mate bond, which she had tried to bury under layers of resentment and medical logic, roared to life, a tether of white-hot heat connecting her heart to the man outside. The door didn't crash open this time. Instead, the handle turned with a slow, deliberate click that sounded like a hammer being cocked on a pistol. Cale Draven stepped into the dim light of the clinic, his presence instantly making the reinforced concrete walls feel like a cardboard box. He wasn't the broken, bleeding man who had collapsed in the mud weeks ago. He was a king in full command of his power, dressed in a charcoal suit that hugged his broad shoulders like armor. His eyes, those piercing orbs of molten silver, locked onto hers with a focus that felt like a physical weight. "You have a habit of disappearing, Amara," he said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in the soles of her feet. He didn't move toward her, yet she felt as if he were already surrounding her. The sheer magnetism of his aura was suffocating, a reminder of the night they had spent together in the dark. Because he was an alpha, he didn't ask questions. He stated facts, his tone carrying the expectation of total submission. Amara forced her chin up, her eyes flashing with a defiance she didn't truly feel. "I didn't disappear, Kyle. I stayed exactly where I belong. You're the one who crawled out of here like a thief in the night." She crossed her arms over her chest, a defensive posture meant to hide the slight rounding of her belly that only she could see. She had to stay cold. She had to remember that this man represented the hierarchy that had stripped her of her birthright. Kyle took a single step forward, his movements possessing the fluid grace of a wolf stalking its prey. "I had a pack to secure and a traitor to hunt. I didn't think you'd be so eager to see me again." He paused, his nostrils flaring as he took a deep, lingering breath of the air. His expression shifted from arrogance to something sharper, a sudden, lethal intensity that made Amara's pulse skyrocket. He moved closer, his gaze dropping to her waist before snapping back to her eyes with a terrifying clarity. The silence that followed was a living thing, a predator waiting to spring. Amara held her breath, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could see the moment the realization hit him, the way his pupils dilated until his eyes were almost entirely black. The air in the room grew cold, the temperature dropping as his alpha fury began to bleed into the environment. He knew. The bond had whispered the truth to him the moment he stepped into her space. "What is that scent, Amara?" he whispered, his voice dangerously soft. He was inches away now, the heat radiating from his body making her head swim. He reached out, his hand hovering just above her stomach, though he didn't touch her. There is a heartbeat inside you that carries the rhythm of my own. Why didn't you come to me? Why did you hide the heir to the northern throne in a hole in the wall? Chapter 5. The Night of Burning Truth. The moon was a jagged shard of bone hanging in the sky, casting a pale, sickly light over the city as the storm returned with a vengeance. Inside the clinic, the tension had reached a breaking point, a fever that refused to break. Kale refused to leave, his presence a permanent stain on the sanctuary Amara had worked so hard to build. He paced the small room like a caged beast, his shadow stretching long and distorted across the floor. Because he was an alpha, he saw her pregnancy as a strategic asset, but Amara saw the look in his eyes. It was more than just politics. You think you can just walk in here and claim a life you didn't even know existed? Amara challenged, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and exhaustion. She was sitting on the edge of the surgical table, her hands gripped tightly together. The room was illuminated only by the flickering emergency lights, casting the two of them in a dance of orange and black. She felt vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with physical strength. Kale stopped his pacing and turned to face her, his expression a mask of granite. I am not claiming an asset, Amara. I am claiming my mate and my child. He moved toward her, his shadow swallowing her whole as he loomed over her. Do you have any idea what the world is like out there? My enemies used silver to try and end me. If they find out you are carrying my blood, they won't just kill you, they will erase you from history. The honesty in his voice was a sharp blade that cut through her defenses. Amara looked up at him, her eyes searching his for any sign of the deception she expected from his kind. And what about your pack, Kale? The Great Northern Pack rejected me 10 years ago because I wasn't pure enough to serve their bloodline. Now you want to take me back there as a trophy? I'd rather raise this child in the dirt than see them grow up in a cage of your making. A thunderclap shook the building, and as the sound died away, a different noise rose from the alley. The sharp, unmistakable clatter of breaking glass and the heavy thud of boots. Amara's instincts flared, her wolf side snarling at the intrusion. Kyle didn't hesitate. In one fluid motion, he pulled a handgun from his holster and pushed Amara behind the heavy metal supply cabinet. Stay down, he commanded, his voice dropping an octave into a primal growl. The back window shattered as a flashbang grenade detonated, filling the room with a blinding white light and a high-pitched scream of noise. Amara squeezed her eyes shut, her hands over her ears, her heart feeling like it was going to burst. Because she was pregnant, her senses were overloaded, the explosion feeling like a physical assault on her brain. She heard the rapid-fire exchange of shots, the grunts of men in pain, and the terrifying sound of a wolf's snarl. When the smoke cleared slightly, she peered around the corner of the cabinet. The clinic was a war zone. 3 men in tactical gear lay on the floor, but more were pouring through the broken window. Kyle was a blur of violence, his movements too fast for the human eye to track. He had shifted partially, his claws extended and his teeth bared in a mask of feral rage. He wasn't just fighting to survive, he was fighting to protect the space behind him. They're rogues! Amara shouted over the din, noticing the jagged brand on the neck of one of the fallen attackers. But these weren't the broken outcasts she treated. These were professional mercenaries, hunters trained to kill alphas. One of them leveled a rifle at Kale, the barrel glowing with the faint blue light of a silver-tipped round. Amara didn't think. She grabbed a heavy tray of surgical instruments and hurled it with all her strength, distracting the shooter just long enough for Kale to tear his throat out. The air smelled of ozone, blood, and burnt gunpowder. Kale stood in the center of the carnage, his chest heaving, his suit jacket shredded and soaked in crimson. He turned to her, his eyes still glowing with the silver light of the wolf. The anger was gone, replaced by a raw, naked fear that shook Amara to her core. He reached out, his bloody hand shaking as he touched her cheek. "We have to go," he rasped. "They know you're here. The clinic is burned." Chapter 6. The Iron Sanctuary. The black SUV tore through the rain-slicked streets, the engine a low, predatory growl that matched the mood inside the cabin. Amara stared out the window, watching her life as she knew it vanish into the darkness. She had left her clinic, her equipment, and her independence in a pile of smoking rubble. Because she had no other choice, she was now sitting next to the man who represented everything she feared. The scent of his blood filled the car, a thick, coppery smell that made her stomach churn with a strange mix of nausea and concern. Kyle gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles were white. He hadn't spoken since they left the alleyway, his focus entirely on the road and the rearview mirror. He was bleeding from a shallow graze on his temple, the wound refusing to close because of the silver trace in the air during the fight. Amara reached into her bag, pulling out a clean bandage and a small bottle of antiseptic she had managed to grab. "Stay still," she muttered, leaning across the center console. Kyle flinched as she pressed the cloth to his head, but he didn't pull away. For a moment, the silence between them changed. It wasn't the silence of enemies, but the shared breath of survivors. As she worked, she could feel the heat of him, the steady beat of his heart echoing the rhythm of the child inside her. The bond was a hum in the background, a constant reminder that they were no longer two separate entities. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice small against the roar of the rain. Kyle's eyes flickered toward her, a brief flash of silver in the dark. "To the northern stronghold. It's the only place with a high-grade silver dampener and a guard detail I can trust. My beta Elias will meet us at the perimeter." He paused, his jaw tightening. "Amara, I know you hate the pack, but you are carrying the future of my people. I will do whatever it takes to keep you safe, even if it means protecting you from the pack itself." The car began to climb, the city lights fading as they entered the dense, ancient forests of the Northern Territory. The trees stood like giant sentinels, their branches heavy with water. Amara felt a cold dread settling in her chest. Returning to these lands felt like walking back into a nightmare. She remembered the whispers, the cold stares of the high-ranking she-wolves, and the way the previous alpha had looked at her like she was a stain on the carpet. They reached the gates of a massive estate, a fortress of stone and glass nestled into the side of a mountain. High-intensity floodlights swept over the car as the gates groaned open. Men in dark uniforms stood at attention, their eyes scanning the perimeter with professional detachment. This wasn't a home. It was a military installation. Cale parked the car in a subterranean garage, the silence that followed the engine's cut-off feeling heavier than the noise of the drive. As they stepped out of the vehicle, a man with sharp features and a calculating gaze approached them. This was Elias, the beta who had been the architect of the pack's logistics for a decade. He looked at Kyle's wounds, then shifted his gaze to Amara. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Not surprise, but a cold, satisfied recognition that made Amara's skin crawl. It was a look of a man who had been waiting for a specific piece to fall into place on a chessboard. "The rooms are prepared, Alpha," Elias said, his voice as smooth as polished silk. "And the medical wing has been sanitized as per your instructions. We weren't expecting a guest of this nature." He bowed slightly to Amara, but the gesture felt like a mockery. Because she had spent years reading subtext in the underground, she saw the hidden edge in his tone. He didn't see a Luna. He saw a complication. Cale placed a possessive hand on the small of Amara's back, a gesture that was as much a warning to Elias as it was a comfort to her. "She is not a guest, Elias. She is the mother of my child. Her word is my word. Is that understood?" The Alpha's voice was a whip crack, leaving no room for argument. Elias bowed lower this time, his expression unreadable, but the tension in the air didn't dissipate. Amara allowed Kyle to lead her toward the elevator, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched by 1,000 hidden eyes. As the doors closed, she looked at Cale, her heart heavy with a new kind of fear. She was inside the heart of the beast now, protected by a man she didn't trust, from a pack that didn't want her, while carrying a secret that everyone wanted to control. The sanctuary of the clinic was gone, and the war for the air had truly begun. Chapter 7. The Gilded Cage. The air in the northern stronghold was too clean, a sterile mountain breeze that lacked the honest grit of the city streets Amara had called home. Because her body was now a map of heightened sensitivities, every luxury in the suite felt like a subtle insult. The silk sheets were too smooth against her skin, the ambient lighting too soft, and the silence of the stone walls was a heavy weight that pressed against her eardrums. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the mist roll over the jagged peaks of the territory she had been exiled from a decade ago. It was a beautiful prison, guarded by men who called her Luna, with their mouths while their eyes screamed, "Stain." She traced the faint rhythmic pulse in her abdomen, the only thing that felt real in this world of artifice and power. The child was a spark of heat in a landscape of ice. Behind her, the heavy oak door clicked open, and the scent of cedar and cold rain announced Cale's arrival before he even spoke. He had traded his blood-soaked suit for a dark tactical sweater that emphasized the sheer scale of his frame. He moved through the room with a restless energy, his silver eyes scanning her face for signs of the break he clearly expected. "The medical staff is ready to see you, Amara," Cale said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to settle in her bones. He didn't come closer, respecting the invisible boundary she had drawn between them since they arrived. "I've brought in the best specialists from the coast. They need to ensure the silver exposure during the attack didn't cross the placental barrier." Because he was an alpha, his concern was framed as a directive, a logistical necessity for the survival of his line. Amara turned away from the window, her expression a mask of cold professionalism. "I am a doctor, Cale. I know exactly what my child needs. I don't need a committee of pack loyalists poking at me to ensure the property is intact." She saw his jaw tighten, a flash of irritation flickering in his gaze. She knew she was pushing him, testing the limits of the patience he was clearly struggling to maintain. She needed to know if he was a man she could negotiate with, or just another tyrant wearing a crown of obligation. Cale took a step forward, the space between them shrinking until she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "This isn't about property. It's about survival. My enemies didn't just stumble upon your clinic, Amara. Someone leaked your location, someone knew exactly where I went to heal." The gravity of his words hung in the air, a dark shadow that darkened the room. The attack wasn't a random act of rogue violence. It was a targeted strike from within his own inner circle. The realization sent a chill through her blood that had nothing to do with the mountain air. If Cale's own pack was compromised, then the walls of this stronghold were no safer than the alleyways of the city. She looked at him, seeing the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. For a fleeting second, the alpha vanished, and she saw the man who had whispered her name in a fever-induced delirium. He was a king surrounded by ghosts, and she was the only living thing he had left to hold on to. Chapter 8. Echoes of Betrayal. The medical wing was a cathedral of glass and steel, hidden deep within the mountain's core. Amara allowed the scanners to hum over her, the rhythmic clicking of the machinery a steady drone that masked the whispers of the nurses in the hallway. They thought she couldn't hear them, but the pregnancy had tuned her ears to the frequency of malice. They spoke of the rogue girl and the tainted heir, their voices dripping with the same poison that had been used to exile her 10 years ago. Because the pack hierarchy was built on the myth of purity, her presence was an existential threat to their order. As she dressed in a private alcove, a shadow fell across the doorway. It was Elias, the beta whose eyes held the cold precision of a ledger. He was holding a tablet, his thumb scrolling through a series of old files with a detached curiosity. "It is fascinating, isn't it?" he mused, not looking up as she stepped out. "How history has a way of repeating itself. 10 years ago, you were standing in a similar room, being told your blood was incompatible with the Northern line. And yet, here you are, carrying the very thing they said was impossible." Amara froze, her hand tightening on the strap of her bag. "I was rejected because the Alpha at the time decided I wasn't worthy. It was a political move, nothing more." She tried to keep her voice steady, but the mention of her past was a scab being ripped off a wound that had never truly healed. She remembered the humiliation, the way the pack had turned their backs on her as she was led to the border. She had been a girl then, broken by a system she didn't understand. Elias looked up, a small, chilling smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Not quite, Amara. You were rejected because someone changed the results of your compatibility test. They made it look like your union with the Alpha's son would result in a sterile line. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The records were supposed to be destroyed, but I have a habit of keeping things that others find inconvenient. Your rejection wasn't a matter of fate, it was a deliberate, calculated betrayal. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Amara felt a roar of static in her brain, the sound of a decade of self-loathing being incinerated by the truth. She hadn't been unworthy. She had been a threat. Someone had feared her bloodline so much that they had systematically dismantled her life to keep her away from the throne. The rage that followed was a cold, sharp thing, a blade that cleared away the fog of her distrust. She wasn't just a victim of a cruel world. She was the survivor of a conspiracy. "Who did it?" she rasped, her vision tunneling until only Elias remained. The beta tapped the screen of his tablet, pulling up a digital signature from a decade ago. The order came from the council, authorized by the high beta of the time, a man who felt that a rogue-born girl had no place in the royal genealogy. He paused, his gaze boring into hers. That man is still on the council, Amara, and he is the same man who is currently questioning the legitimacy of the child you are carrying. He didn't just want you gone, he wanted your line erased. 9. Chapter 9. The Alpha's Declaration. The Great Hall was a cavernous space of dark wood and roaring fireplaces, the air thick with the scent of wet fur and expensive bourbon. The Pack Council had gathered, a collection of elders and high-ranking wolves who looked at Amara as if she were a plague brought into their sanctuary. Kale sat at the head of the long table, his face a mask of iron, his hands folded in front of him. Because the Pack was on the verge of a civil war, every word spoken in this room was a potential spark in a powder keg. Amara stood at the foot of the table, her presence a silent challenge to the men who had spent 10 years believing they had won. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the way they leaned away from her as if her rogue status were contagious. At the far end of the table sat Elder Silas, a man whose skin looked like yellowed parchment and whose eyes held the glint of a serpent. He was the one Elias had named. The architect of her ruin was sitting 10 feet away from her, sipping wine as if he hadn't destroyed a woman's soul for sport. "The girl is a rogue, Alpha," Silas said, his voice a dry rasp that filled the room. "The child she carries is a gamble we cannot afford. We have traditions, protocols for the succession that have kept this pack strong for generations. To allow a child of unknown provenance to claim the northern throne is an insult to every wolf in this territory." He looked around the room, gathering the silent nods of the other elders like a harvest of spite. Kale stood up, the movement so sudden and violent that several chairs scraped back against the stone floor. The temperature in the room plummeted, his alpha aura expanding until it felt as if the walls themselves were bowing under the pressure. "Tradition is the shield of cowards, Silas," Kyle growled, his voice a primal sound that silenced the room. "You speak of provenance while you hide behind lies. I have seen the records. I know what was done to Amara 10 years ago." A ripple of shock went through the council, the elders exchanging panicked glances. Silas's face paled, his grip tightening on his glass until the stem snapped. Kale moved around the table, his steps slow and predatory, until he was standing directly behind Amara. He didn't touch her, but his shadow fell over her like a cloak of iron. He was no longer just her mate. He was her champion, a king declaring war on his own court to protect the woman they had tried to break. "This woman is not a guest, and she is not a rogue," Kale declared, his voice echoing off the high rafters. "She is the Luna of the Great Northern Pack, and the child she carries is the only heir this throne will ever see." He turned his gaze to Silas, his eyes glowing with a terrifying molten silver light. "If anyone in this room questions her legitimacy again, They will answer to me on the dueling grounds. Is that understood?" The silence that followed was absolute. Amara felt a strange, dizzying sensation, a mixture of triumph and a terrifying sense of responsibility. She looked at Cale, seeing the raw, unyielding loyalty in his eyes. He had chosen her, not because of a bond, not because of a child, but because he saw the injustice that had been done to her. In that moment, the gilded cage vanished, replaced by a battlefield. She was no longer running from the pack. She was going to lead it. As the council filed out in a stunned silence, Silas paused by the door, his eyes meeting Amara's for a fleeting second. There was no remorse in his gaze, only a cold, simmering promise of a final betrayal. The war for the Northern Throne had moved from the shadows into the light, and Amara knew that the most dangerous moments were still to come. She reached out and took Cale's hand, her fingers interlacing with his. Because she was no longer alone, the system meant to destroy her was about to be transformed. Chapter 10. The Fractured Peace. The air in the mountain stronghold had turned brittle, a thin sheet of ice ready to crack under the weight of a single misstep. Amara stood in the center of the training courtyard, watching the pack warriors spar in the early morning mist. Because the council meeting had stripped the veneer of civility from the court, the atmosphere was thick with a new, jagged tension. The soldiers moved with a frantic energy, their eyes darting toward her with a mixture of awe and simmering resentment. She was the rogue who had become a Luna, a living contradiction to the laws they had spent their lives defending. She felt the heavy, rhythmic thud of a pulse against her ribs, not her own, but the child's. The air was growing stronger, its presence a constant hum of power that made her skin feel too tight. Beside her, Cale stood like a statue carved from obsidian, his arms crossed over his chest. He hadn't left her side for more than an hour since the declaration. His possessiveness wasn't a cage anymore, it was a shield, but even a shield could become a burden when the arrows were coming from every direction. "They look at me like I'm a bomb waiting to go off," Amara murmured, her voice barely audible over the clashing of wooden practice swords. Cale didn't turn his head, but his jaw tightened. "They look at you because you represent change, and change is terrifying to those who benefit from the status quo." He finally looked at her, his silver eyes softened by a warmth he saved only for her. "But they will learn. Loyalty isn't born from tradition, Amara. It's born from strength. And you have more strength in your smallest finger than Silas has in his entire bloodline." The mention of the elder made the bile rise in her throat. Because she now knew the truth of her past, every interaction with the pack elders felt like treading on a minefield. She wasn't just a guest, she was a witness to their corruption. She could see the small groups of wolves whispering in the shadows of the stone arches, their faces obscured by the gray light. The pack was fracturing, divided between those who saw Cale as a visionary and those who saw him as a traitor to the pure wolf lineage. A sudden commotion at the main gate broke the morning's rhythm. A scout on horseback, a rare sight in the age of SUVs, galloped into the courtyard, the animal's breath coming in white plumes. The rider tumbled from the saddle, his face pale and smeared with mud. "Alpha!" he gasped, clutching a leather cylinder. "The western border outposts. They've been breached. Not by rogues, by the Shadow Pack." The air in the courtyard froze. The Shadow Pack was a myth used to scare pups, a collection of outcasts and zealots who believed in the total subjugation of the human world. To have them at the borders wasn't just a skirmish. It was a declaration of total war. Cale's aura flared, a crushing weight that brought the younger warriors to their knees. He took the cylinder, his eyes scanning the parchment inside, and for the first time, Amara saw a flicker of genuine dread in his expression. Chapter 11. The Poisoned Well. The war room was a hive of frantic activity, the walls covered in digital maps and ancient topographical charts. Amara sat in the corner, her presence a silent anchor in the chaos. Because she was a doctor, she saw the war differently. not as a series of tactical maneuvers, but as a coming harvest of trauma. She watched Elias, the beta, as he moved markers across the screen. He was too calm, his movements too precise. While the rest of the room was sweating with anxiety, Elias looked like a man finishing a crossword puzzle. The breach occurred at the exact moment the perimeter sensors went into a diagnostic loop, Elias explained, his voice smooth and devoid of emotion. It was a sophisticated bypass. Whoever did this had the encryption keys for our primary defense grid. He looked at Kale, his expression one of regretful logic. It suggests a leak at the highest level of the Security Council. The accusation hung in the air like a poisonous gas. Kale slammed his fist onto the table, the holographic map flickering under the impact. "Silas," he spat, the name a curse. "He's trying to force my hand. He wants me to choose between the border and the stronghold." Kyle turned to Amara, his eyes dark with a desperate conflict. He couldn't leave her here with a traitor, but he couldn't let his people die at the border because he was playing bodyguard. Amara stood up, her voice clear and resonant. "Go, Kyle. If you stay here, you prove the elders right, that you've prioritized a rogue over the pack's safety. Take the main force to the border. I'll stay here. I have my own guards, and I have the clinic staff I've recruited from the village." She saw the protest forming on his lips and stepped toward him, taking his large hands in hers. "Because I am the Luna of this pack. I have to be the one they see standing firm while their alpha is at the front. Don't make me a reason for your failure." Kale leaned down, his forehead resting against hers in a moment of raw, unshielded vulnerability. "If a single hair on your head is touched, I will burn this mountain to the ground, Amara. I don't care about thrones or lineages. I care about you." He kissed her with a ferocity that tasted of salt and desperation, a silent promise of a return that felt more like a prayer than a plan. As the sun began to set, the courtyard was filled with the roar of engines and the haunting howls of wolves shifting for battle. Amara stood on the balcony, watching as the lights of the convoy disappeared into the dark forest. The stronghold felt suddenly massive and empty, a tomb of stone and secrets. She turned to find Elias standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the flickering torchlight of the hallway. "A brave choice, Luna," Elias said, his voice echoing in the silence. "But bravery and wisdom are rarely the same thing." He stepped into the room, and for the first time, Amara noticed he wasn't wearing his tactical gear. He was carrying a small ornate box, the kind used for ceremonial offerings. "The elders have sent a gift, a peace offering to ensure the health of the heir while the alpha is away." Amara didn't move, her instincts screaming a warning that was louder than any alarm. "I don't accept gifts from men who tried to erase my life, Elias. Take it back." She saw his hand tighten on the box, his knuckles white. The mask of the loyal beta was slipping, revealing a cold, calculating ambition that had been hidden in the shadows for years. He wasn't Silas's puppet. He was the puppeteer. Chapter 12. The Beta's Gambit. The room felt as if the oxygen were being sucked out of it, the silence heavy with the weight of an impending strike. Amara backed away toward the desk where she kept her emergency medical kit, her eyes never leaving Elias. Because she had spent her life navigating the treachery of the underground, she saw the shift in his posture. The way he balanced his weight, the way his eyes tracked her movements like a hawk. He wasn't here to deliver a gift. He was here to finish what the silver-tipped blade had started in the alleyway. "Silas is a fool," Elias whispered, his voice dripping with a casual contempt. "He thinks in terms of tradition and bloodlines. He wanted to reject you to keep the pack pure. But I see the potential in your blood, Amara. A child born of a rogue mother and an alpha father. That is a weapon that could unite every pack on the continent under a single banner." He opened the box, and the room was suddenly filled with the sweet, cloying scent of hemlock and crushed wolfsbane. Amara's head spun, the toxin hitting her system with a violent intensity. She grabbed the edge of the desk, her legs turning to water. You were the one at the clinic, she rasped, her vision beginning to tunnel. You didn't want Kale dead. You wanted the heir. Aaliyah smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing she had ever seen. I needed a catalyst. Kale is a good alpha, but he is sentimental. He would waste the child's potential on things like choice and love. I will raise the heir to be a god. He moved toward her, his hand reaching out to catch her as she collapsed. Because the alpha is at the border, there will be no one to hear your screams, Amara. By the time he returns, the story will be that the Shadow Pack infiltrated the stronghold and took the Luna. As her knees hit the floor, Amara's hand closed around a heavy glass paperweight on the desk. With the last of her strength, she swung it upward, catching Elias across the temple. He roared in pain, his grip loosening just enough for her to scramble toward the door. Her heart was a frantic drum, the child inside her surging with a protective energy that felt like a bolt of lightning through her veins. She burst into the hallway, her lungs burning, her mind a frantic blur of escape routes. The stronghold was dark, the emergency lights casting long red shadows that looked like pools of blood. She could hear Elias's heavy footsteps behind her, the sound of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. She didn't head for the gates, they were guarded by men loyal to the Beta. Instead, she headed down, toward the ancient, forgotten tunnels that led to the rogue clinic she had established in the lower village. Amara! Elias's voice echoed through the stone corridor, distorted and monstrous. You cannot hide from the blood. The child wants to be found. She reached the heavy iron door of the cellar, her fingers fumbling with the lock. Because she was a doctor, she knew her body was failing, the toxin slowing her heart to a dangerous rhythm. She slipped inside and bolted the door just as a massive weight slammed against the other side. She was in the dark, surrounded by the smell of earth and damp stone. She wasn't a Luna here, and she wasn't a guest. She was a mother fighting for the life of her child in the only place she truly understood: the shadows. The door groaned under another impact, the wood beginning to splinter. Amara reached into her pocket and pulled out her emergency flare. She looked at the dark tunnel ahead of her, the path that led back to the world that had rejected her. She had come full circle, but this time she wasn't running away. She was leading the hunter into the mouth of the wolf. Chapter 13. The Descent into Shadow. The air in the cellar smelled of ancient dust and the cold, damp scent of subterranean earth. Amara pressed her back against the vibrating wood of the bolted door, her lungs burning with the sweet, cloying residue of the hemlock Elias had used. Because her body was fighting for two, the toxin felt like lead in her veins, slowing her reflexes until every movement felt like wading through deep water. She could hear the rhythmic, thunderous impact of the Beta's shoulder against the iron-reinforced oak, a sound that resonated in her very teeth. Elias wasn't just trying to open a door. He was trying to break the last obstacle between him and his prize. She fumbled with the emergency flare in her pocket, her fingers numb and clumsy. The child inside her surged, a sudden, sharp kick against her ribs that felt like a jolt of pure adrenaline. It was as if the air recognized the predator on the other side of the wood and was demanding she move. Amara took a ragged breath, the darkness of the tunnel stretching out before her like the throat of a massive beast. She knew these passages. They were the forgotten veins of the mountain, built by the original rogues who had carved out a life in the shadows of the great northern pack. A terrifying crack echoed through the small room as the top hinge of the door gave way. Amara didn't wait for the next strike. She turned and plunged into the darkness, her hand trailing along the rough, moss-covered stone of the tunnel wall to guide her. The ground was uneven, slick with the runoff from the mountain's springs, making every step a gamble. Because she was a doctor, she could feel her heart rate dropping to a dangerous level, the wolfsbane in the air trying to force her into a permanent sleep. Behind her, the sound of the door finally splintering apart was followed by a silence more terrifying than the noise. Elias had entered the cellar. She could hear the soft, predatory click of his boots on the stone, the sound of a man who knew his prey was trapped in a cage of her own making. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He moved with the quiet confidence of a gardener walking through a row of flowers he intended to harvest. "The darkness won't hide you, Amara." Elias's voice drifted down the tunnel, distorted by the stone until it sounded like it was coming from inside her own head. "Your scent is a beacon. It's the smell of a dying throne. Why fight the inevitable? You were born in the dirt, and your child belongs to the mountain. Let me take the burden from you." Amara reached a fork in the path, her mind racing through the mental map she had memorized during her first week at the stronghold. One path led to the old silver mines, a death trap for any wolf. The other led to the lower village clinic, but it was a mile of treacherous, winding stairs. She stopped, her hand resting on her stomach, feeling the heat radiating through her clothes. She had a choice to make, and because she was a mother, the choice was already made. She wouldn't just run, she would lead the traitor into a place where his alpha strength meant nothing. Chapter 14: The Heart of the Mountain. The air grew colder as Amara descended deeper into the mountain, the walls narrowing until her shoulders brushed against the damp rock on both sides. The silence here was absolute, broken only by the frantic thud of her heart and the distant, rhythmic drip of water. She had reached the edge of the old silver mines, a place where the very stone was infused with the metal that acted as a slow poison to their kind. Even as a rogue with a diluted bloodline, she could feel the tingle of it in her teeth, a metallic taste that made her stomach turn. For a man like Elias, a high-ranking beta with a pure, powerful wolf, this place would be a nightmare. The silver in the walls would act like a dampener, stripping away his heightened senses and leaving him as vulnerable as a human. Because she was a doctor, she knew how to manage the exposure, but Elias would be blinded by his own arrogance. She found a small alcove and tucked herself inside, the rough stone biting into her back as she waited for the sound of his approach. She could hear him now, his breathing becoming labored as the silver dust in the air began to affect his lungs. He was closer than she had anticipated, his footsteps heavy and uneven. The confidence in his voice was gone, replaced by a strained, jagged edge. "Amara, come out. You're killing, both of you, staying down here." He coughed, a wet, rattling sound that echoed through the narrow passage. Amara stepped out into the center of the tunnel, her emergency flare held high but unlit. The faint, bioluminescent moss on the walls provided just enough light for her to see his silhouette. Elias looked like a ghost, his skin pale and his eyes wide with a frantic, unfocused energy. He had shifted partially to fight the silver, his claws out and his teeth bared, but the transformation was ragged and incomplete. He looked less like a god and more like a mangled beast. "You should have stayed in the sunlight, Elias," Amara said, her voice steady despite the tremors racking her body. "In this place, we're all just meat and bone. Your title doesn't protect you here." She saw him lung, his movements slowed by the toxic air. She dodged to the side, her smaller frame allowing her to navigate the cramped space with a grace he couldn't match. He slammed into the wall, a groan of pain escaping his throat as the silver-infused stone burned his skin. He turned, his eyes glowing with a desperate, dying light. I will have that child. It is mine. By right of vision." He reached for her, his hand closing around her shoulder with a grip that threatened to crush the bone. Amara didn't scream. She brought the flare up and struck the ignition cap against the wall. The world exploded into a blinding chemical red light, the heat of it searing the air between them. Elias shrieked, his eyes, sensitive from the darkness and the silver, burning under the sudden intensity of the flare. He fell back, clawing at his face, the smell of singed hair and ozone filling the tunnel. Amara didn't stay to watch him fall. She turned and ran, the red light of the flare casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She had to reach the exit before the flare burned out, before the mountain claimed her as well. Chapter 15. The Alpha's Return. The forest floor was a blur of shadows and silver as Kale tore through the undergrowth, his wolf in total control of his body. He had sensed the breach the moment Elias had struck. a sudden, agonizing tear in the mate bond that had felt like a hot iron being pressed into his soul. He had abandoned the border, leaving the command to his generals, his only thought the woman he had left behind in the gilded cage. He had run for hours, his muscles screaming, his breath coming in white plumes of frost, driven by a primal fury that threatened to consume him. He reached the perimeter of the stronghold, expecting to find a war zone. Instead, he found a terrifying silence. The guards were at their posts, but their eyes were glazed, their movements mechanical. They had been drugged or enchanted. Kyle didn't stop to question them. He followed the scent, the sweet, cloying smell of hemlock and the sharp, coppery tang of Amara's blood. It led him to the cellar, to the splintered door and the dark maw of the tunnels. He shifted back into his human form at the entrance, his chest heaving, his skin slick with sweat. He grabbed a heavy flashlight from a wall bracket and plunged into the dark. "Amara!" he roared, the sound echoing through the mountain like a thunderclap. He could smell the silver now, the toxic dust making his wolf howl in protest. He didn't care. He pushed deeper, his vision tunneling as he searched for the one scent that mattered. He found Elias first, a broken heap of a man lying in the center of the silver mine passage. The beta was alive, but his eyes were clouded and his skin was covered in chemical burns from the flare. Kale didn't feel pity. He felt a cold, murderous rage that made his vision turn red. He stepped over the traitor, his boots crunching on the silver dust, his focus entirely on the faint, rhythmic sound of a heartbeat further down the tunnel. "Kale." The voice was a whisper, a fragile thread of sound that nearly broke his heart. He rounded the corner to find Amara leaning against the exit door of the tunnel, her face pale and her clothes torn. She was holding the child, her hands protecting her stomach as she slumped against the iron. He reached her in a single stride, pulling her into his arms with a desperation that shook his entire frame. Because he was an alpha, he wanted to growl, to claim, to destroy. But because he was her mate, he simply held her. "I have you," he whispered into her hair, his tears mixing with the grime on her face. "I have you, Amara. It's over." Amara looked up at him, her eyes tired but clear. "It's not over, Kyle. Elias was just the beginning. The pack is broken." She took a ragged breath, her hand finding his. "But the air is safe, and I'm not running anymore." Kale looked at the woman in his arms, the rogue who had survived a conspiracy, a silver mine, and a traitor. She wasn't a victim, and she wasn't just a Luna. She was the anchor of his soul. He picked her up, his strength returning as the mate bond pulsed with a new, unbreakable power. He walked out of the tunnels and into the light of a new dawn, a king carrying his queen back to a throne that was about to be rebuilt in her image. Chapter 16. The Fragile Dawn. The air in the medical suite felt heavy with the scent of ozone and the sharp clinical sting of advanced healing salves. Amara lay on the elevated bed, watching the sunrise bleed across the peaks of the northern mountains through the reinforced glass. Because the silver dust from the mines still lingered in her system, her veins felt like they were filled with liquid ice, a constant, numbing reminder of the descent she had barely survived. She shifted slightly, wincing as the movement pulled at the bruised muscles of her side, but her hand never left the rounded curve of her stomach. The child was quiet now, a steady, rhythmic pulse that seemed to be recovering from the trauma alongside her. Kyle was a silent sentinel in the corner of the room, his massive frame silhouetted against the growing light. He hadn't changed his clothes. The dark sweater was torn at the shoulder, and his knuckles were stained with the dark, dried evidence of his rush through the tunnels. He looked like a man who had walked through hell and found the gates locked behind him. Because he was an alpha, his instinct was to project a fortress of strength. But Amara could see the slight tremor in his hands as he watched the monitors tracking her vitals. The silence between them was a thick, suffocating thing, filled with the echoes of the words they hadn't said in the dark. "You should sleep, Kale," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp that seemed to startle him. "The pack won't fall apart in the 3 hours it takes for you to close your eyes." She watched him turn toward her, his silver eyes reflecting a depth of weariness that made her heart ache. He looked less like a king and more like a man who had realized that his crown was a target pinned to the people he loved. Kale moved to the side of the bed, his presence instantly heating the air around her. He reached out as if to touch her cheek, then pulled back, his fingers curling into a fist. "I almost lost you in those tunnels because I was arrogant enough to believe my name was enough to protect you." His voice was a low, jagged rumble that vibrated in the floorboards. "I left you with a snake while I went to fight shadows at the border. Every minute I spent away from you was a betrayal I can never take back." Amara looked at him, her gaze unwavering. "You didn't betray me, Kyle. You did what an alpha does. You protected your people, but I'm not just one of your people." She took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his, forcing him to meet her eyes. "I trusted you to keep the world away from me, and the world came through the basement door anyway. Because I am a rogue, I expected it. But because you are Kale, I expected you to be the one to find me." The admission was a bridge, a fragile connection built on the ruins of their mutual distrust. Chapter 17, The Weight of the Crown. The recovery was slow, a grueling process of physical healing and psychological fortifying. Amara refused to stay confined to the medical wing, her restless spirit driving her to walk the halls of the stronghold, despite the lingering fatigue. She saw the way the servants whispered when she passed, their eyes wide with a new kind of terror. They didn't see a rogue girl anymore. They saw the woman who had burned a beta's eyes out with a flare and survived a silver mine. She had become a legend in the dark, a figure of mythic resilience that the pack didn't know how to categorize. She found herself in the library, a vast room filled with ancient scrolls and the history of a people who had tried to erase her. Because she was a doctor, she searched for the medical records Elias had mentioned. The files that proved her bloodline had been sabotaged. She found them hidden behind a false panel in the genealogy section, a series of ledgers that detailed the systematic exclusion of rogue-born wolves from the northern line. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a policy of erasure, a deliberate attempt to keep the pack in a cycle of stagnant purity. "It's a legacy of lies," a voice said from the doorway. She turned to see Kale standing there, his expression grim. He walked to the shelf and took one of the ledgers from her hand, his thumb brushing over the names of the exiled. "My father knew, and his father before him. They believed that if they let the outside in, the pack would lose its identity." He looked at her, a fierce, protective light in his eyes. They didn't realize that by keeping the world out, they were just building a bigger cage for themselves. This child, our child, is the end of that cage. Amara felt a wave of vulnerability wash over her, a sudden, sharp realization of the burden they were placing on an unborn life. They'll never accept it, Kyle. Even with Elias gone, the council will find another way to strike. They don't see a child, they see an ending. She leaned against the mahogany shelf, her breath hitching as the reality of their situation settled into her bones. How can we raise a baby in a place where every shadow holds a knife? Kale stepped closer, his hands resting on her shoulders, grounding her. We don't raise them in this place. We change the place. He pulled her into his chest, his scent of cedar and cold rain surrounding her like a shield. Because you are the Luna, you have the power to reform the clinics, the schools, the laws. And because I am the Alpha, I have the power to break anyone who stands in your way. It was a promise of a future that felt both beautiful and terrifying, a commitment to a war that would never truly end. Chapter 018, The Shattered Mirror. The peace was a lie, a thin veneer of calm that shattered when the news reached the stronghold that Elias had died in his holding cell. The official report said it was the silver poisoning, but the whispers in the hall said he had taken his own life to avoid the Alpha's final judgment. For Amara, the news brought no relief, only a sense of impending dread. A dead traitor was a martyr for the cause of the old ways, a symbol that the pure bloods could use to rally their remaining forces. She found herself back in the cellar where the descent had begun, the air still holding the faint metallic tang of the silver. She stood at the entrance to the tunnels, her flashlight cutting through the dark. She needed to see it one more time to reclaim the space where she had almost been broken. Because she was a doctor, she knew that trauma lived in the body, and the only way to release it was to face the sight of the wound. "You shouldn't be down here alone," Cale said, his voice echoing from the stairs. He didn't sound angry, only concerned. He walked to her side, his hand finding the small of her back. "This place belongs to the past now, Amara. You don't have to carry the darkness anymore." Amara looked into the tunnel, her eyes reflecting the beam of the light. "I'm not carrying the darkness, Cale. I'm looking for the light I left behind." She turned to him, her expression a mix of sorrow and determination. Elias was right about one thing. The system is built to destroy people like me. If we don't tear it down, root and branch, then we're just waiting for the next Elias to wake up. She reached out and touched his face, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. "Do you trust me enough to let me break the pack to save it?" Cale closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. The weight of his responsibility seemed to lift for a fraction of a second, replaced by a raw, unshielded love for the woman before him. "I would let you burn the world if it meant I could stand in the ashes with you." He pulled her into a kiss that tasted of salt and desperation, a sealing of a pact that went deeper than blood or bonds. They were no longer just an alpha and his mate. They were two rebels standing at the edge of a new era. The morning light found them still in the cellar, planning the restructuring of the Northern Territories. They would open the borders, integrate the rogues, and build the first pack-sanctioned clinic for all wolves. It was a dream that felt like a madness, a goal that would invite the fury of every other pack on the continent. But as Amara looked at Cale, she saw the man who had found her in the dark. Because they were together, the system meant to destroy her was about to become the one she transformed. Chapter 19. The Iron Law. The air in the High Council chamber was thick with the scent of burning sage and ancient, dusty tapestries. Amara stood beside Cale's throne, her posture a defiant line of silver and steel. Because the pack was on the precipice of a total schism, the council members sat in a semicircle of stony silence, their eyes fixed on the empty chair where Silas used to sit. The news of Elias's death had acted as a catalyst, curdling the remaining elders' resentment into a sharp, pointed weapon. They didn't see the woman who had saved their alpha. They saw a rogue who had brought the stench of the streets into their sacred halls. Kyle sat with his hands gripped on the armrests, his aura a heavy, suffocating weight that filled the room. "The borders are open," he announced, his voice a low vibration that made the crystal chandeliers tremble. "As of this morning, any wolf seeking sanctuary, rogue or packborn, will be granted passage and medical care under the new Luna's jurisdiction." He looked at the council, his silver eyes challenging them to utter a single word of protest. He was no longer negotiating. He was dictating the terms of a new world. Elder Varric, a man with skin like wrinkled parchment and a voice like dry leaves, stood up. "You are breaking the first law, Alpha. To invite the unbonded into the heart of the mountain is to invite the rot." He pointed a trembling finger at Amara. "This woman has bewitched you. She has turned the silver wolf into a lapdog for the discarded." The insult hung in the air, a spark in a room filled with gunpowder. Amara felt a surge of heat in her chest, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. Kyle was on his feet in a blur of motion, the heavy mahogany table splintering under the pressure of his hand. "Varric, you speak of rot while you sit in a room built on the lies of the men who tried to kill me." He stepped down from the dais, his presence expanding until the elders shrank back in their seats. "The first law is survival. And we are not surviving. We are decaying. If you want to challenge my decree, do it now. On the stone. With blood." He gestured toward the ceremonial dueling circle etched into the floor, the challenge clear and lethal. Chapter 20. The Breaking Point. The atmosphere in the stronghold was a taut wire, humming with the threat of violence. Amara spent her days in the new clinic, her hands steady as she treated the first wave of rogues who had dared to cross the border. Because she was a doctor, she found peace in the work, but the stress of the political war was taking a silent, heavy toll on her body. Every time she walked the halls, she felt the eyes of the loyalists, men who had served Kale's father and who viewed her as a parasite. She knew the duel was coming. Kale was an alpha, and in this world, some arguments could only be settled with teeth and claw. She was finishing a suture on a young girl's arm when a sharp, white-hot pain lanced through her abdomen. Amara gasped, her hand flying to the table for support as the room tilted on its axis. It wasn't the rhythmic kick of the air. It was a cold, tearing sensation that made her vision blur into a tunnel of gray. "Not now," she whispered, her breath coming in ragged hitches. "Please, not now." She knew the symptoms. The stress and the residual silver from the mines were triggering a premature labor. Outside in the courtyard, the roar of the pack echoed through the stone. The challenge had been accepted. One of the council's elite champions, a man who had remained silent during the meetings, had stepped forward to fight for the purity of the pack. Kyle was already in the circle, his shirt discarded, his skin glowing with the sweat of anticipation. He didn't know that while he was fighting to protect her future, her body was beginning to fail her in the present. Amara tried to stand, but another wave of pain crashed over her, forcing her to her knees on the cold tile of the clinic. She was alone in the back room, the sounds of the duel beginning to filter through the windows, the wet thud of bodies colliding, the guttural snarls of shifting wolves, and the cheering of a pack divided. Amara reached for the emergency radio on the counter, her fingers trembling so hard she could barely grip it. She had to tell Kale. She had to warn him that the heir was coming before the mountain claimed them both. But as she pressed the button, a shadow fell across the doorway, and the cold click of a lock echoed in the small room. Chapter 21. The Final Push. The duel in the courtyard was a brutal display of alpha dominance. Kale was a blur of silver fur and raw fury, his claws leaving deep gouges in the stone floor. His opponent was larger, a mountain of black muscle who fought with the desperation of a man who believed he was saving his race. They circled each other, their breathing a rhythmic growl that matched the drumbeat of the pack. Kale wasn't just fighting a man, he was fighting the weight of 1,000 years of tradition. He could feel the mate bond thrumming with a frantic, jagged energy, a signal of distress that made his wolf howl with a primal urgency. Inside the locked clinic room, Amara stared up at Elder Silas. He had escaped his confinement in the chaos, his eyes wild with a fanatic's light. He held a small, silver-tipped dagger, the blade shimmering in the dim light. "If the Alpha will not preserve the line, I will," Silas whispered, his voice a ghost of madness. "The child cannot be born, Amara. It is the only way to save the northern pack from the rot you brought with you." He moved toward her, his hand shaking with the weight of his resolve. Amara looked at him, the pain in her body secondary to the cold clarity of her survival instinct. "You think you're a savior, Silas? You're just a coward who's afraid of a world where you don't hold the whip." She reached behind her, her hand closing around a heavy glass vial of paralytic agent. As Silas lunged, she threw the liquid into his face and rolled to the side, the silver dagger whistling past her ear. Silas screamed, clawing at his eyes as the chemical began to freeze his facial muscles. In the courtyard, Kale felt the sudden spike of Amara's terror through the bond. It gave him the final, explosive burst of strength he needed. He dove under the Black Wolf's guard, his jaws closing around the challenger's throat in a decisive, crushing grip. He didn't kill him. He pinned him to the stone until the man shifted back, defeated and broken. Kyle stood over him, his chest heaving, his eyes turning to the clinic windows. "Amara!" he roared, the sound shattering the silence of the defeated council. He reached the clinic door just as the lock shattered from the inside. Amara stumbled out into the hallway, her face pale, her hands covered in the blood of her own struggle. She collapsed into his arms, the heat of his body the only thing keeping her conscious. "Kale, the baby," she gasped, her eyes searching his for the strength she no longer possessed. "It's time. It's coming now." Kale picked her up, his alpha fury transforming into a desperate, focused tenderness. The duel was over. The champion was defeated. But the real battle for the future of the Northern Pack was happening in the silence of the labor room. Chapter 22. The Birth of a New Moon. The labor room was a sanctuary of flickering candlelight and the heavy, rhythmic sound of a woman fighting for a future that hadn't existed yesterday. Amara gripped the leather handles of the birthing bed, her knuckles white, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts of steam in the cool mountain air. Because her body was a bridge between the old world and the new, every contraction felt like a mountain shifting beneath her skin. Kyle was behind her, his massive chest a solid wall for her to lean against, his hands resting over hers in a silent pact of shared pain. He wasn't the alpha of the North in this room. He was a man witnessing a miracle he didn't deserve. Outside the reinforced doors, the pack was silent. The howl of the wind was the only sound echoing through the stone corridors. The warriors, the elders, and the rogues stood together in the great hall, their ears tuned to the heart of the stronghold. They were waiting for a cry that would either signal the end of their history or the beginning of their evolution. Amara pushed, her vision blurring into a kaleidoscope of silver and red, her soul reaching for the child that was a perfect blend of Kale's fire and her own iron-willed survival. "One more, Amara," Kyle whispered into her ear, his voice a low, grounding vibration that seemed to pull her back from the edge of exhaustion. "One more and the world is ours." With a primal scream that shattered the last of her emotional walls, Amara felt the sudden, overwhelming release of pressure. The silence that followed was absolute, a void that lasted for a heartbeat before it was filled by a sharp, demanding cry. It was the sound of a life that refused to be quiet. The midwife, a rogue woman Amara had trained herself, held up a small, wriggling bundle wrapped in white linen. The child's eyes snapped open, one a piercing molten silver, the other a deep, soulful brown. The Alpha Heir was born, a living testament to a love that had defied every law of the pack. Chapter 23. The Choice of the Luna. The celebration in the stronghold lasted for 3 days, but inside the private chambers, the world was quiet. Amara sat in a large velvet chair by the fire, the child sleeping soundly in a cradle carved from ancient cedar. Because she was finally free from the physical burden of the pregnancy, her mind was sharper than ever, already mapping out the logistics of the new order. She looked up as Kale entered, his movements uncharacteristically hesitant. He carried a small ornate box, the true signet of the Northern Luna, a ring forged from mountain gold, and a single drop of solidified alpha blood. He knelt before her, the firelight casting long, flickering shadows across his rugged features. "The pack is waiting to swear their oaths to you, Amara, not as the mother of the heir, but as the woman who broke the council and saved the line." He held the box out to her, his gaze intense and vulnerable. "The mate bond brought us together and the system tried to tear us apart, but I don't want you to stay because of a bond or a baby. I want to know if you choose me." Amara looked at the ring, then at the man who had walked into her clinic as a stranger and become her world. She remembered the rejection, the cold streets, and the years of believing she was nothing. She looked at the scars on Kale's hands, scars he had earned fighting for her in the tunnels and the dueling circle. "I spent my whole life being told who I was supposed to be, Kale. I was a rogue, then a victim, then a vessel." She reached out and took his hand, pulling him up until he was sitting on the edge of her chair. "But when I look at you, I don't see a fate I can't escape. I see a partner I want to build with." She took the ring from the box and slid it onto her own finger. "I choose you. Every day, for the rest of our lives." The kiss that followed was quiet and certain, a sealing of a contract that was written in choice rather than blood. They stood together and walked to the balcony, looking out over the territory. The borders were gone. The fences were being dismantled, and the first official pack clinic for all wolves was already under construction in the valley below. The Great Northern Pack was no longer a fortress. It was a sanctuary. Chapter 24. The Epilogue of the Rogue 5 years later. The sun was setting over the northern peaks, painting the snow in shades of violet and gold. Amara stood on the porch of the clinic, watching a small boy with unruly dark hair chase a butterfly through the tall grass. He moved with a grace that was both wild and disciplined, a perfect fusion of the two worlds he represented. He stopped and looked back at her, his mismatched eyes glowing with a mischievous light before he shifted into a small, silver-flecked wolf and tumbled into the wildflowers. Cale walked up behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist as he rested his chin on her shoulder. The tension of the early years had softened into a deep, abiding peace, though his eyes still scanned the perimeter with the instinct of a protector. "He's getting faster," Cale remarked, a note of pride in his voice. "The scouts say he's already tracking elk in the lower woods." "He's a bridge, Cale," Amara replied, leaning back into his warmth. "He's proof that the system meant to destroy us only made us stronger." She looked at the village below, where smoke rose from the chimneys of homes belonging to both packborn and rogues. They lived together, worked together, and fought together. The purity that Silas had obsessed over had been replaced by a vibrant, resilient diversity that had made the Northern Pack the most powerful territory on the continent. Because a woman who was once publicly rejected had dared to trust an alpha, the world had been remade. The rejection was no longer a mark of shame. It was the foundation of their legend. As the moon began to rise, full and bright over the mountain, a single howl echoed from the valley, a sound of belonging that was echoed by 100 others. Amara smiled, her hand finding Cale's in the dark. The story wasn't about a bond that was forced. It was about a love that was chosen. And in the north, the moon always shone brightest on those who had survived the night.